AMLP Illyrian MLP ETF. This fund will normally invest at least 90% of its total assets in securities that comprise the underlying index. The underlying index is comprised of energy infrastructure MLPs that earn a majority of their cash flow from the transportation, storage, and processing of energy commodities. It is non-diversified. Illyrian MLP ETF pays quarterly dividends to shareholders, and last annual dividend yield was 7.03%. This ETF has expense ratio of 0.87%.
GDX Van Eck Gold Miners ETF. This fund normally invests at least 80% of its total assets in common stocks and depository receipts of companies involved in the gold mining industry. The index is a modified market capitalization weighted index primarily comprised of publicly traded companies involved in the mining for gold and silver. The fund is non-diversified. The dividend is paid once per year and dividend yield is 2.14%. Expense ratio of this ETF is 0.51%.
JEPI JP Morgan Equity Premium Income ETF. This fund seeks to provide the majority of the returns associated with its primary benchmark, the Standard & Poor's 500 Total Return Index, S&P 500 Index, while exposing investors to less risk through lower volatility and still offering incremental income. Under normal circumstances, the fund invests at least 80% of its assets in equity securities. It may also invest in other equity securities not included in the S&P 500 Index. Dividend is also paid every month, and last dividend for this ETF was 13.35%. This ETF has expense ratio of 0.35%.
MLPA Global XMLP ETF. This fund invests at least 80% of its total assets in the securities of the underlying index. Moreover, at least 80% of the fund's total assets will be invested in securities that have economic characteristics of the Master Limited Partnership (MLP) asset class. The underlying index is intended to give investors a means of tracking the performance of the energy infrastructure MLP asset class in the United States. The fund is non-diversified. ETF pays quarterly dividends to shareholders and last annual dividend yield was 7.03%. This ETF has expense ratio of 0.45%.
QYLD Global X Nasdaq 100 Covered Call ETF. This fund will invest at least 80% of its total assets in the securities of the underlying index. The CBOE Nasdaq 100 by Right Index is a benchmark index that measures the performance of a theoretical portfolio that holds a portfolio of the stocks included in the Nasdaq 100 index, and writes or sells a succession of 1-month at-the-money Nasdaq 100 index covered call options. It is non-diversified. Last monthly dividend was 12.12%. Expense ratio is 0.6%. SDIV Global X Super Dividend ETF. The fund invests at least 80% of its total assets in the securities of the underlying index and in American Depository Receipts (ADRs) and Global Depository Receipts (GDRs) based on the securities in the underlying index. The underlying index tracks the performance of 100 equally weighted companies that rank among the highest dividend-yielding equity securities in the world, including emerging market countries. SDIV dividend is also paid every month, and last dividend was 12.86%. This ETF has expense ratio of 0.58%. XYLD Global X S&P 500 Covered Call ETF. This fund invests at least 80% of its total assets in the securities of the underlying index. The underlying index measures the performance of a hypothetical portfolio that employs a covered call strategy. A covered call strategy is generally considered to be an investment strategy in which an investor buys a security and sells, or writes, a call option on that security in an attempt to generate more income. Last monthly dividend was 11.98%. Expense ratio for this ETF is also 0.6%.